And welcome, everybody. Glad you could make it this morning. Well, as we're all keenly aware, China-U.S. relations have slipped to new lows over the last 2 or 3 years, leading to widespread concerns that the two countries may well be headed for a new Cold War. That is, until just last week, or a week and a half ago, when President Biden and Xi Jinping met in San Francisco, as June mentioned, at the sidelines of the APEC Economic Conference. While the ramifications of that so-called summit are still quite unclear, it looks like some meaningful improvement in the tone of relations may just be underway. So that is encouraging. So it could hardly be more timely to welcome a speaker this morning whose expertise focuses on this issue, especially as it relates to China's clearly stated intention to eventually absorb Taiwan into mainland China. So let me introduce Zach Cooper. Zach is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, specializing in U.S. strategy in Asia and China, and specifically China's apparent intent to eventually take Taiwan by force if more peaceful means fail. Among the numerous positions Zach has held include Senior Fellow for Asian Security at the Center for Strategic International Studies, CSIS, Co-Director for the Alliance for Securing Democracy, Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Plan of the United States, and Research Fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. He's also served in government as an assistant to the Deputy National Security Advisor for Combating Terrorism at the National Security Council and as a special assistant to the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the Defense Department. So Zach, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today, and we look forward to your remarks on a very front burner topic. So it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Tyler and June. It's really wonderful to be with you. And the best part of my job is getting to actually get out of Washington, at least virtually out of Washington, and talk to folks across the U.S. about U.S.-China dynamics and understand how you're thinking about these issues and what you're most worried about. And so I'm really looking forward to the discussion period after I give some opening remarks. So I want to talk about three major issues. The first is what's happening in China. The second is how the United States is reacting to what's happening in China. And then the third, as you mentioned, Tyler, is Taiwan. And obviously, Taiwan is absolutely critical in the U.S.-China dynamic, but we've got an election coming up in Taiwan in just about a month and a half. And so that's really, in many ways, the focus of so much of the U.S.-China tension right now. And so I want to end with that. So let me start with what's going on in China, because if we were having this conversation 5 years ago, it would have been a very different conversation. The China that most Americans saw 5 years ago was an incredibly strong, rapidly growing, and confident China. Right? If you think back before COVID hit, the Chinese economy was still slowing a little bit compared to the double-digit GDP growth that it had had for nearly 35 years. But, you know, a normal year of growth in China about 5 years ago would be 7, 8, 9% growth rate, which was often 3-4 times what we were seeing in the United States. So you were watching as China really caught up quite quickly to the United States in its economic size and the GDP per capita. So it was both that the economy was growing, but also that people in China were becoming much richer, much more quickly than many people had expected. Another thing that was going on 5 years ago is that Xi Jinping was in the midst of his second term in office, and many people expected then that he might try and take a third. But the Xi regime looked to be in a very strong place. There were no signs of dissent. Xi had not really come under any significant pressure, and it seemed that he was this remarkably strong leader with a real mandate to shift what China was doing in a number of areas. Certainly not to reform or to open China, in many ways to crack down and actually strengthen the Communist Party's grip on all elements of society within China. But I think most people would have assessed that Xi Jinping was in a pretty strong place domestically, and that many things were going his way 5 years ago. Another thing that is quite different now than it was 5 years ago is the demographic picture. So demographics change slowly. I don't want to suggest that there's been any precipitous decline in Chinese demographics, but what we know about Chinese demographics has shifted pretty substantially, which is to say that just a few years ago, we were talking a lot about whether China could convince many of the Chinese people to have more than one child. And for those of you that remember this history, a few decades ago, the Communist Party had decided that having more than one child was not in the interest of the party. And so they had basically mandated that everyone in China was only allowed to have a maximum of one child. This is the so-called one child policy. Now, when Beijing decided to try and open up the gates and allow people to have 2 or even 3 children later, it turned out that people didn't actually want to have more children. And I think this makes sense looking back, but it was a bit counterintuitive at the time. If you've grown up as an only child and your parents were perhaps only children, then the idea of having 2, 3, or more children, it's a little bit unnatural. But the demographic picture as a result has really gotten quite dark. And I was saying just before we started that there are reports that there are going to be under 10 million births in China this year, which is, perhaps even lower than one might have expected. We are expecting by 2100, by the end of the century, to see the Chinese population decline by basically half, by 700 million people. So China will lose basically twice as many people as the United States has in total by the end of the century. So this demographic shift, it was underway before, but I think it's clearly worsened, or our understanding of it has worsened in the last 5 years. And then just 2 last factors that I would point out. One is that China's standing abroad has gotten much worse very quickly. I talk a lot with Chinese experts and officials. They usually blame this on the United States, but I have to be honest, I'm not sure that Americans are that convincing abroad when we complain about China. I think mostly this is China's own actions. And let's be honest, also, this trend cut across both the Trump administration and the Biden administration. And so it's not clear to me that the United States is at fault for this the way the Chinese would often expect. In fact, I think what's happened is that China has overstepped in a number of countries around the world, and we've seen a counter reaction. You can look at this in Korea in 2017 when China took action against South Korea. It banned some department stores from a company called Lotte and some other goods. We saw a pretty rapid reaction among the Korean populace, and China has become much less popular than it was. And you could tell the exact same story in Japan, in Taiwan, in Australia, in India, in the Philippines, in much of Europe, in Canada, and on down the line. And almost all of these polls are predated by some action that Beijing took, whether it was taking some Canadians hostage back about 3 or 4 years ago, whether it was economic coercion against Australia, or rampant disinformation against Taiwan. And so China's standing abroad has also decreased. And this leads me to the last factor that's changed pretty quickly over the last 5 years, is the short-term prospects for the Chinese economy. So I mentioned that the Chinese economy had been growing at 7, 8, 9%. And that actually undercounts the sort of growth that we'd seen in many parts of China, especially the coastal provinces, where in many years the growth had been closer to 12 or 15% year-on-year growth. And you all know compounding interest well. This is pretty remarkable if you think about what 12 or 15% year-on-year growth does over a couple of years. And so people have gotten used to this. And now, 5 years later, what we're seeing is not 7, 6, even 5% growth. I think the common expectations for China this year economically are maybe 3% growth, perhaps 2% growth. You'll find some China experts who even think that there was no growth in China over the last year. So regardless of what the exact numbers are, you've got a population in China that basically made a deal with the Communist Party. And the deal was that they would give up some political rights, some representation, in order to have rapid economic growth. But now, for the first time in their lives, that economic growth is slowing significantly. And yet, if anything, the party seems to be exerting even more control over what people say and do in China. This is true if you're a business person. This is true certainly in the political circles. And it's true even for academics, sort of like I am, who very much feel that they are constrained, much more constrained now than they've been in decades. So what does this all add up to? A really rapid shift in China, where things have become much darker, both domestically and internationally, and the prospects for China's future have become much darker because of slowing growth, because of the political repression, because of the slowing demographic prospects, because of China's worsening view abroad, and then finally because of this near-term concern about the economy. And what does this look like? Well, it looks like 50% unemployment rate among youth in China, right? And I think this is hard for Americans to even appreciate. We're down at 3-4% unemployment. Certainly youth unemployment's a bit higher, but 50% unemployment, it's hard for many Americans to even conceptualize what this will look like. And so, of course, this is creating a lot of churn in Beijing, and I think some real concern within the party that they have to come up with some new solutions to figure out how to manage this situation. So that's what's been going on in China over maybe the last 5-10 years. And all of these dynamics have been increasing the concern in the United States that actually the China we're seeing is not the China we had hoped to see. So when I was in government 15, 20 years ago, the Bush administration put forward what it called the responsible stakeholder theory. And the basic logic of this theory was that as China became stronger, as it became more prosperous, that the people of China would essentially turn towards openness. They would want more political rights, and that slowly over time, China might both open up and the political system might open up. And so as China became richer, it would actually become more of a responsible stakeholder in the global order, more engaged in the international system. And in short, that the more the United States could accelerate this process, the more we would get the China we wanted, which was a responsible, active member of the global society. And actually what we got, in my view, and in the view certainly of the Trump and the Biden administrations, is the exact opposite. We got a China that is, in fact, more repressive at home and more assertive abroad. And so I want to talk now not about what's happening in China, but how the United States has responded and the tough dynamic that this has created. And I think we saw a little of this on show when Joe Biden and Xi Jinping met just a few weeks ago. So the Biden team came into office, and I know you've had Jake Sullivan up to speak at the library a few years ago. So Jake Sullivan, currently the National Security Advisor, he wrote a very famous article with the leader for Asia within the White House. His name's Kurt Campbell. And they said that basically the United States had to have a completely different strategy for dealing with China. And the era of engagement was over, and the US had to have a new approach. And so what did that approach look like? Well, they rejected what they said were sort of two basic logics of how to deal with China. On the one hand was this hope that I mentioned earlier that China would become a responsible stakeholder. Sometimes people call this the hope for a condominium, a US-China condominium. The idea being that leaders from the US and China would sort of get together, they would figure out how to run the world, And because their interests would be so shared, this wouldn't be that difficult. And the hope that some people had was that this G2, this condominium between the US and China, could be how the new world order was sort of run. And Jake Sullivan, Kirk Campbell, before they come into office, they explicitly reject this approach. And they say it's not realistic. It's not the direction that Xi Jinping wants to go, and therefore it's not a direction that the United States should attempt to go either. What they also reject at the same time is what they call a sort of regime change or regime failure approach, where the US would explicitly reject the Communist Party as its main interlocutor in China. And I think for many of us, this feels natural. The United States doesn't have a lot of ability to change the control over who's actually running the government in China. Even if the United States explicitly came out and opposed the Communist Party or exposed some of the corruption that we see from the Communist Party or from Xi Jinping and his family themselves, that would be unlikely to change the form of government in China. And so they explicitly came in and said that their objective was not to return to a condominium, but also not to try and hope for a change in government in China. And so what they laid out was actually a series of commitments about what they did not want the US-China relationship to look like. And I'll just read you a couple of the quotes from senior Biden administration officials. They said, quote, "They have no interest in containing China. They do not seek a new Cold War. They do not see the relationship through the frame of great power competition or conflict. They do not seek to block China from its role as a major power. They do not seek to block China from growing its economy. They do not seek to decouple from China. They do not seek to transform China's political system." For all of these commitments, the United States tried to make very clear that it wasn't trying to change China's government. It wasn't trying to seek a Cold War or something of that sort. It was looking at a more limited steady state. So in other words, what I'm trying to argue is that the Biden team came in and they rejected the very idea that the US and China could actually get to a new end state, a better end state. They rejected the idea that the US and China could work out these differences themselves, and that China would become a responsible stakeholder in the existing system. But they also rejected the idea that China would see its regime fail, or that the US should encourage that. So what did that leave the Biden administration with? Well, what they argued is that the United States should embrace what they called a steady state. So not an end state, but a steady state. And what does a steady state look like? It looks like what they're trying to do out of San Francisco when Xi and Biden met, which is to have meetings, but to avoid direct conflict between the US and China. We don't know exactly what all of the elements would be of this strategy. There is a China strategy that the administration has done. It is classified, so we can't talk about it openly. But they've articulated elements of the strategy in public. And I think some of the key elements are that they want stability in the US-China relationship to the extent that it's possible. To have that stability, they think that we need to have what they call guardrails, or crisis management mechanisms in place. This means that if there's a military challenge between the US and China, that our leaders can actually talk to one another. This is a little bit harder than it sounds because, in fact, in past incidents, when the United States has tried to call the Chinese leadership, actually the Chinese have not picked up the phone. So a lot of work to do there. Another element of this steady state that they're hoping for is an economic relationship that would be more fair. And you've seen the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, you've seen Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo. They've articulated this argument that actually one of the core issues that the US and China have to work on is ensuring that the relationship is more symmetrical, right? That it's more even, that China is not launching massive state subsidies into areas that would directly damage US companies or stealing huge amounts of intellectual property from the United States. And so the idea that the Biden administration has put forward, in short, is that there should be a steady state. and that getting to that steady state is the task that they've sort of set for themselves. And the goal, as Jake Sullivan himself said, is not to bring about some fundamental transformation of China itself. Their strategy, as the White House has asserted, is not premised on an attempt to change the People's Republic of China, that's Beijing's domestic governance model, but rather to accept that governance model and work within it to have a less challenging relationship. And here I'll editorialize a bit and say, I think what we've seen in the last 3 years is a really serious good faith effort to try and put the US-China relationship on a sounder footing. And I think that has basically failed. And to be, very candid here, I think what we saw at the Biden-Xi meeting is that the Chinese don't even accept the idea that we're in a competitive relationship. When they put out their press statement after the meeting, they were loath to accept that there's actually a competition between the US and China. They want to focus on what they call win-win cooperation. This was the language they used 5 years ago or 10 years ago to try and convince the Obama administration that US-China relations could really fundamentally improve. But in fact, what we've seen more recently is a growing view in Washington, and I think elsewhere in the United States, that actually the US-China relationship is not going to improve. It's not going to get better. The best we can hope is to stabilize it. And even that is probably a bridge too far. And the way a great China expert named Orville Schell put this is that Xi's aggressiveness has put a stake through the heart of the engagement policy as a viable policy for the United States or for the West. So what does that leave us with, right? If we can't convince experts on US-China dynamics that the US-China relationship is actually going to improve, what are we left with? And I think what we're left with is essentially a very difficult relationship with lots of potential problems and no easy solutions. Not things that can be fixed when Xi and Biden meet, whether that's in San Francisco or Bali or elsewhere. So it wasn't a surprise to me that there were basically no major outcomes from the Xi-Biden meeting. The two meetings that they agreed to restart were a couple of military meetings and then some dialogues on economic issues. And then theoretically, there's going to be some progress by the Chinese side on restricting fentanyl precursors from getting into the United States. I don't want to minimize that. That's very important, but it's nothing like what you would agree from a major summit between the leaders of the world's two largest economies. So in other words, our expectations now for the US-China relationship are remarkably low. We're not talking about improving the relationship. We're just talking about stabilizing it and avoiding conflict for the near term. Where this leads, I think, is increasingly to concern about how to manage the Taiwan situation. And so this is the third and last issue before I hand it back to you, Tyler. So the Taiwan issue is the hardest one in US-China relations, for a number of reasons. The main one is that it is something that is really at the core of the US-China relationship going back to 1949. This was the real precipitating cause of the US and China having a difficult relationship from 1949 to 1979. And even when the US-China relationship restarted under the government in Beijing rather than the one in Taipei in 1979, Taiwan still was basically an issue that we couldn't agree on. And so we have this very complex set of not even agreements, acknowledgements by the United States that acknowledges China's position on Taiwan, but doesn't agree with China's position. And what this leaves us with is basically an area where both sides see the status quo differently. Many Americans believe that the status quo effectively is that Taiwan has a high degree of sovereign control over actions that happen on its territory, and that is effectively separate from the government in Beijing. And most Chinese believe that, in fact, the status quo is that Taiwan should be part of China and that this is just a question of when it happens, not if. And you've heard Xi Jinping say that he would be patient for a while on Taiwan, but not forever, when he met Joe Biden just a few weeks ago. So we often talk when we talk about US-China dynamics as if Taiwan doesn't have a say, but of course that's not true. The people on Taiwan are going to have their say in just about a month and a half. They have a big election coming up. The current ruling party is called the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP. And they have the vice president of that party running for office, running for the presidency, along with the person who had been Taiwan's representative in Washington. And the two of them are running for election. They are just barely leading the polls right now, but it's a close run thing. And over the last few weeks, the opposition parties attempted to join together and failed to do so. So the main opposition party, called the KMT, the Kuomintang, you think about the nationalist government, actually founded by Chiang Kai-shek. So this is sort of the one of the two opposition parties. The other is a new upstart party called the TPP, led by a leader named Ko Wen-je. And so these two parties have been competing both with each other and with the current ruling party for who would be in power in the election that happens on January 13th in Taiwan. Some really fascinating stuff has happened. We can talk about this more in the discussion if people would like. But essentially what happened is that the efforts to run on a joint ticket, a joint opposition ticket, have failed. They failed for a lot of reasons, some having to do with very specific domestic political issues in Taiwan, some having to do with lack of understanding by one of the candidates of the arrangement that they thought they had made to run together. But the bottom line is that it now looks more likely than not that the current ruling party, the Democratic Progressive Party, is going to win in January. And this is something to watch very closely, because the government in Beijing, the Communist Party, views the current government in Taiwan as sort of rabble rousers. And they have made this critique of the current president of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen. I can tell you, having dealt with her a fair amount, saw her twice this fall, she's anything but a rabble rouser. She is a fairly quiet trade lawyer. She is fairly cautious, but Beijing has not viewed her this way. And they are convinced that her vice president, who is running to succeed her, is, as they would say, more extreme. Now, I don't want to get too much into this because Americans shouldn't weigh into Taiwan's political decisions, but I'll just say it's pretty clear that he's a little bit less restrained than Tsai Ing-wen is. But we'll have to see exactly what he would do if he were to win the presidency. But regardless, what we should expect over the next month and a half is growing Chinese pressure on Taiwan ahead of Taiwan's election. And this is why I'm such a pessimist about the US-China relationship. We've had this meeting between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping. It went fine, but there were no breakthroughs. And now we've got a crisis that's likely to happen in the next couple of months, which is China's reaction to Taiwan's domestic election, right? And this is going to be very difficult for the United States. It's going to be difficult because the United States will not want to weigh in at all into Taiwan's election. But if we see China weighing in heavily, the US will want to push back against those actions, especially if China uses the threat of military force, as it has suggested to some of us that it might, to persuade people in Taiwan to vote against the current ruling party. So we're walking into a period of a couple of months that I think will be very difficult. And it's difficult for another reason, which is that Taiwan's election is in January, but the inauguration would not happen until May. And so what that sets up is basically a 6-month period, which is often fraught in US-China dynamics and in cross-strait dynamics as well. And so I would expect that the US and China are going to have a very difficult time managing this issue. It is seen as a real red line by the Chinese, And Taiwan, as you all know, has never been a more popular topic in the United States as well, and including on the campaign trail. I can tell you a few years ago, if you'd asked a presidential candidate about Taiwan and the campaign trail, they probably wouldn't have had much of an answer for you. And now it's sort of the first thing on foreign policy that any of the presidential candidates need to get smart on. So, bottom line is we've seen a remarkable set of changes in China over the last 5 or 10 years. I think they've, in general, been some pretty negative changes, both about China's domestic governance structures and about its actions abroad. That has fed into a cycle in the United States in which we've reevaluated our China policy. We've decided that the era of engagement is over, but we're not really sure what comes next. But what we do know is coming next is a very difficult period driven by an election in Taiwan and an election in the United States in which US-China issues will be front and center and quite fraught. So I'm sorry to leave you with a bit of a dark cloud, but I think that's where we are. So with that, I'll hand it back over to the committee and look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Zach. That was a great summary of a lot of key issues going on there. Well, we're chagrined that you're so pessimistic. My gosh, I thought you were going to say that because Xi and Biden bragged about their limos, you know, in a lighthearted manner, that somehow there was a new era of conviviality that was going to start. Apparently not. Could you clarify the famous strategic ambiguity issue? You know, we all know that we're trying to skirt around any direct commitment if we can, although my understanding is that Biden, in recent comments over the last maybe year or so, has on 4 different occasions specifically said he thinks the US military would intercede directly if Taiwan were invaded. Is that the message you get?
Yeah, this is such a critical issue. And so, you know, I want to stress here that I'll give you my personal view, but experts in Washington are quite divided on what I'm about to say. So I think what you've heard from President Biden is his personal view about whether he would fight for Taiwan's defense. And the answer is that he would. He said this 4 times. I happen to be pretty close friends with much of his White House team that handles Asia. I'm very confident that the president had not been given instructions to say this. He just said it on his own because it's what he believes. And so what you're hearing from the president is not technically US policy, in fact. In some ways, it's sort of at odds with US policy because, as you mentioned, Tyler, the longstanding US policy on Taiwan is what we call strategic ambiguity. This was the idea that the United States would not say explicitly whether it would get involved in a Taiwan contingency. We would sort of leave this up to the imagination, and various presidents have had very different views on this issue. But Joe Biden is saying explicitly that if China did an unprovoked attack against Taiwan, that he would stand militarily with Taiwan. Now, this raises questions about whether the US is still ambiguous about its commitment to Taiwan or whether it should be. My personal view is that it's actually very difficult for the US to outline its Taiwan policy in a very clear way. And let me just spend 1 minute on this because I think it's really critical and most people don't understand it. So the reason the US had a policy of strategic ambiguity is because in the past, when we have drawn very clear red lines, including early in the Cold War, what we've learned is that often you draw a very clear red line. You have to say what you would defend and what you would not. So, for example, the United States said early in the Cold War that we would not defend mainland Asia, including Korea. What happened? Well, we saw a communist attack against South Korea, and then we changed our minds, right? We decided actually we should have had Korea within the defensive perimeter. The fear on Taiwan is that if we draw a very clear perimeter around Taiwan, the Chinese are going to test whatever we don't put into that perimeter. So it's not just the main island of Taiwan that we have to worry about. There are these outlying islands. that we also have concerns about. Many of these outlying islands are so close to China that you could see them, they're 3 or 5 miles away. They are completely indefensible. So if the United States says that we are going to have a policy of strategic clarity, we have to be clear about whether we would defend those islands or not. And either way, in my view, we lose. If we say we're going to defend them, then the Chinese know this is a bluff and they could call the bluff. And then it looks like we were making an empty commitment to Taiwan. If we say we're not going to defend them, then the Chinese can just overrun them, knowing that the US won't intervene. Either way, the US looks weak. So I think what's tough here for the Biden team is the president wants to make clear that if the Chinese take an action against Taiwan, that he would stand with Taiwan, and he wants to bolster our deterrent by doing that. But he can't jump to this position, which some people call strategic clarity, and say exactly what he's going to do in response to any kind of Chinese action because of this tricky part about where the red lines are drawn. So in short, what that leaves us with is a policy we call strategic ambiguity, but which is a little bit less ambiguous than it used to be. And this is my big critique of the Biden team in terms of how they've handled some Taiwan issues. I think the clearest explanation that we have of what they're doing on Taiwan is that their policy is one of less ambiguous strategic ambiguity. And I got to tell you, no one explains that clearly. No one can explain it clearly. It's not going to convince any American voter. And it's not even something that most politicians can understand or explain to the American people. So I think what we have to see from the Biden team is a really clear articulation of what their policy is on Taiwan, not about where they would draw the red lines, but about how they're approaching the Taiwan issue so the American people can understand it more clearly.
Okay, a real quick additional question, then we'll get some questions from the panel and the audience. Looking at the ominous cloud out there that is projected by Xi's commentary to the PLA, apparently a few years of the Army, People's Liberation Army, that get ready for an invasion of Taiwan in 2027. Now, is that taken very seriously internally, or is there a feeling, well, he was just kind of saying that roughly in 4 or 5 years, we ought to be ready for it? I don't know. It's just, you keep hearing that, and you wonder how serious a fixed date theoretically that could be.
Yeah, it's a great question, Tyler. And again, here, I'll say I have a very strong view on this, but it's not entirely in line with the consensus view in Washington. So take it with a grain of salt. So my view is that the idea that on January 1st, 2027, that Chinese ships are going to start going across the Taiwan Strait is sort of crazy, right? It doesn't make any sense to have a hard deadline like this. And yes, of course, Xi Jinping said in 2022 that he wanted the Chinese military to be ready for operations against Taiwan by 2027. This makes sense because China has 5-year planning processes, and 2027 is the next 5-year plan. And so if you were giving orders to the Chinese military and you wanted them to be prepared for action on Taiwan, you would say, I want you to be ready. Ready by when? Well, ready by the end of the next 5-year period. That ends in 2027. So I don't put much meaning in Xi's urging the Chinese Communist Party's military, the People's Liberation Army, to be ready by 2027. I don't think that year has that much specific meaning. Now, of course, we should be concerned that he wants to have the capability to take Taiwan at all. But I come from a little bit of a defense background, and if you listen to American military leaders, what they will tell you on China is they want to be ready to fight tonight, right? That's the phrase that the Indo-Pacific Command often uses, fight tonight. Doesn't mean that we're planning to fight tonight. It just means that we want to be ready to do that. And so I think when Xi Jinping says that he wants to have the military be ready by 2027, we should take it in the same way, as something we should be worried about, but not a sign that he is necessarily going to do anything in 2027. Let me just add one quick addendum, Tyler, which is that I actually think this whole timeline argument misses the point. If China is going to take action against Taiwan, I think what's going to trigger that action is a Chinese feeling that someone on Taiwan or in the United States has crossed a Chinese red line, and that the Chinese military therefore has to respond. So in fact, I think this idea that there's a timeline that the Chinese are operating on and that they're planning an operation for some year in the future is wrong. I think if the election in January goes the way that they don't like, they're going to up the ante in January. So 2027 is both the wrong time frame in my view, because it suggests that we have 4 extra years to wait when the Chinese could take action a couple months from now, but also it suggests that, you know, we don't need to worry about these other timelines that some people have put out there, 2032, 2035. You know, I think any of these timelines are possible. So just like we say that we need to be ready to fight tonight, I think the Chinese also in general are thinking about the same thing. And so we've got to be vigilant, not just in 2027, but in the years before and after.
Mhm. But wouldn't you, just quickly, wouldn't you think that if the DPP does win the election, they would go way out of their way not to provoke a red line incident? I mean, it's not in their interest. So I can almost see them calling up Xi on the phone and saying, hey, don't worry about it. Or if anything, we're going to back off a bit and become less, you know, interested in becoming independent, et cetera.
You know, it's a really interesting point. I think the Taiwanese leadership has tried to send that message to Beijing, but the Chinese aren't willing to talk. And so this is one of the real challenges is we've basically had 8 years where the two sides of the strait, Beijing and Taipei, haven't had any substantial conversations. And that's really unhealthy. And so I think part of what many of us are hopeful about is that perhaps after this election, after January or after the inauguration in May, the leadership in China will come to their senses and realize, look, the people on Taiwan are electing political leaders. We may not like them, but we have to deal with them. Unfortunately, that hasn't been the approach that they've taken. So we don't actually have a lot of good messaging from Taipei to Beijing or vice versa. It's all sort of happening in public. And I think that's pretty unhealthy. So you're exactly right that this is something we should be watching really closely.
Yeah. I'm sure the panel has some questions. So, Naomi.
Morning,
Yeah.
Zach. Welcome. Oh, I like that smile. Compared to everything you've just described, it's very welcome. A lot of what I've read has said that the Chinese military and the political leadership are one and the same. So what she says he wants is what they're going to do. Is that correct?
Boy, it's a fascinating question. So as I sort of noted earlier, you know, the United States military, it serves not just the president of the United States or the current political party, it serves the entire country under the Constitution. The Chinese military is not actually the military of the government of China. It is the military of the Communist Party, right? It is the armed wing of the Communist Party. And so theoretically, whatever the general secretary of the party wants to do, Xi Jinping, should be what the Communist Party's military does. Now, I want to preface this by saying that China has become much more opaque in recent years. So I think we have less confidence in our assessments about what's going on at senior levels in China than we used to. But there have been some pretty concerning signs recently. Right. So the Communist Party's top leader is Xi Jinping, but the next level down includes a whole set of leaders on something called the Central Military Commission. They also have a Minister of Defense, or they used to have a Minister of Defense because the Minister of Defense was removed a few months ago and has not been replaced. Where is he? Why was he detained? We basically
I want to follow up on all those disappears as well.
Yeah, you know, and the foreign minister of China also disappeared under questionable circumstances. So I would say, look, if Xi Jinping felt 100% confident that the military was doing exactly what he wanted, it's unlikely that he would disappear the defense minister. So there's clearly something that's not exactly right going on within the party or within the military, or both. But exactly what that is, I don't know, right? And my guess is that it's so opaque, not just to Americans, but to Chinese themselves, that unless you're at the most senior levels of the party, it's entirely opaque to you too. So the other point I would make is, even when the military is very closely controlled, as it is in China, by one leader, it doesn't necessarily mean that that leader is going to have a high degree of confidence in the military, or that they should. And I think the best example of this is what happened in Ukraine, right? Where Putin was in total control of the Russian military, and yet the Russian military basically lied to him about its capabilities. And I think the same is probably going on in China, right? Who in China wants to be the person that goes and tells Xi Jinping, the guy who keeps putting people in jail, that things aren't going well? Well, I wouldn't do it. And so the question is not just, is the party loyal to him? Is the military loyal to him? But are they telling him the truth? And I don't think we know the answer to that question either.
What about in that senior level within China, with senior leaders disappearing routinely? Do we have any inkling of level of resistance or competition, or how they play together or don't?
There's a fascinating story about a year ago. So I mentioned that every 5 years in China, there's this big party congress, where sort of all the new plans are put in place. That happened in 2022 in October. And there were stories, including one that was kind of famous now in the Wall Street Journal, suggesting that the number 2 in China, a guy named Li Keqiang, was essentially pushing back against Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping wanted to crack down on the economy, become more repressive domestically, and Li Keqiang wanted more reform and opening. And the story was that Li Keqiang was pushing very hard a year ago against Xi Jinping, and was sort of blocking some of what he wanted to do. What happened at the party congress? Well, Li Keqiang got thrown out of office. All of his buddies got thrown out of office as well. There was this group called the Communist Youth League that Li was very influential with, that had a long history among recent Chinese leaders. They all got tossed away. And who came in? People personally close to Xi Jinping. But what's particularly confusing about this is that 2 of the people who came in, who were personally close to Xi Jinping, were the foreign minister and the defense minister, who've just recently been detained. So there's clearly something that's broken, that's not working properly within the Communist Party's top leadership. What is it? We really don't know. I mean, there are lots of people with many guesses, but I have to be honest with you that I think our understanding of what's going on at the top levels in China is really limited. And this is the one reason that I was strongly supportive of the Biden-Xi meeting. Talking to anyone now in China is kind of useless if that person isn't influential with Xi Jinping. And we don't know if anybody is influential with Xi. So my view is, it's really important for Biden and Xi to meet so that we can try and get whatever little grist we can into, little bit of insight into what's going on in the Chinese system. But on the question you asked, it's really hard for us to understand on the outside.
Thank you.
Yeah, June.
So when you were talking about the economic situation and unemployment in China, where do you, in all of these young men and women, 50% you were saying, where does that, do you think, takes China? Are they going to become more repressive? Are there going to be revolts? What do you sort of see as sort of the implication of that?
Such a good question. I would say it seems to me that the party is pretty confident that they can control the people at the moment. And there are lots of reasons to believe that they should be confident in this, right? If you're sitting in China now, you're mostly getting information from approved Chinese sources, right? The Great Firewall prevents a lot of information from getting into China. China has cracked down on information access, things like virtual private networks, VPNs, which some of you might use at home for security. These are harder to access now than they used to be. So the party can be more confident now, both that information is getting into China that they've controlled, but also if people in China are trying to organize, that they can control that as well. And yet, just about a year ago, you may remember that there were these protests, these sort of anti-COVID lockdown protests in China. And clearly those got to a level that the Communist Party leadership decided they'd gone too far. And overnight, the leadership went from basically total lockdowns to a complete opening, right? And you know, this was a very serious decision, to be clear. We have no good numbers from the Chinese themselves about how many died in the months or two after this decision. But my assessment would be it's probably between about 1.5 and 2 million people died from COVID right after China opened up. And China was completely unready to open up in many ways. And yet they did it. Why? I think because they were worried about these public protests getting out of control. You might have seen some people holding up white sheets of paper. They didn't want to say what they were protesting against. It wasn't just the COVID lockdowns, right? It was also about Xi's domestic repression, about some of his economic actions. It was a lot of things. So we're in this strange world where the good news for the party is there are not that many youths overall in China. And there's a lot of political research, political science research that suggests that if you don't have a big youth bulge, the danger of protests getting out of control is smaller, which makes sense, right? The youths are more likely to be out there on the streets. You know, old pensioners are unlikely to be trying to overthrow the entire system. And so you might think that the Chinese Communist Party can be pretty confident that it's not going to see a revolt. And yet they were worried enough a year ago to completely overhaul the COVID policy overnight when some protests got a little bit out of control. And now you've got worsening unemployment, an economy that's really struggling, 50% of youth that don't have jobs. I don't think we know where this is headed, and I'm pretty sure the party doesn't know where it's headed. My guess is that they feel that they can control this for the moment, but that if it continues to get out of hand, they will put more restrictive measures in place to make sure that there aren't public protests that could threaten the party's hold on the government.
Peter.
Go ahead, Peter.
Thank you for all these good comments, Zach. I'd like to take you back to the beginning of your remarks, where you talked a little bit about kind of the world view, one administration to the other, but to put it more in the context of the debate going on about whether we are in a unipolar, bipolar, or multipolar world. And I think this is important to understand both from the Chinese perspective and the perspective of the US and Europe for that matter, particularly at a time, as you mentioned, we're into a presidential debate. And this kind of view is going to inform how people debate, how we should deal with China, and really what the US role should be.
I couldn't agree more, Peter. And I again have a pretty strong view on this. I have a big report coming out in the next month or two called Managing Multipolarity. So I think we're in a multipolar world. What do I mean by that? You know, usually when we talk about the three types of polarity in political science, we talk about unipolarity when there's one great power. We talk about bipolarity where there are two competing powers or blocks. And then we talk about multipolarity, where you've got three or more competing power centers. It's not to say that they're all even. You know, even in the Cold War, the US and the Soviet blocs were in no way even. The American bloc was much stronger economically. And yet they were sort of the clear two competing groups. I think now if you look around the world, what you see is that we are in a multipolar system, and a system that's becoming more multipolar over time, but that it's fragmented. I'm not going to go too deep into this, I promise, from this report I'm doing, but basically what I mean by fragmented is that if you look at the world from different lenses, you'll see that it looks different. So if you're sitting in Europe, actually the world looks kind of bipolar, right? You've got democracies like the US and Europe on one side, and then autocracies like Russia on the other. If you're sitting in North America, the world still looks pretty unipolar to a lot of Americans. And the leading journal in the United States that handles foreign policy is called Foreign Affairs. There have been a series of articles this year arguing, in fact, that the world is still unipolar, that it's not bipolar or multipolar. But I will just tell you, as somebody that spends a lot of time in Asia, if you go to Asia, the world looks incredibly multipolar, right? You've got, yes, the United States as one of those poles. You've got China as one of those poles, but you've got India as a rising pole. You've got the third largest economy in the world in Japan. That's still an important player. You've got Europe, which in many ways is not an entirely consolidated pole, but acts often like it is increasingly consolidated. To say nothing of other rising powers, whether that's Brazil, some declining powers like Russia. So in my view, we are in a very complex and fragmented multipolar world. But this is where I get worried, Peter. When I talk to Americans in Washington, I often get the sense that they look at the world as either unipolar, led by the US, or bipolar, led by the US and China. And I just don't think that's right. If you go in the global South, if you go to Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, most of the countries in the rest of the world, they don't think the world is unipolar or bipolar. They think it's multipolar, and increasingly so. And so I hope that Americans can do a better job listening to them and acknowledging that even if we might want the world to be unipolar or worry that the world is becoming bipolar, if the rest of the world thinks it's multipolar, then that's probably what matters the most.
Thank you.
Zach, a quick question. As a practical matter, looking at the summit and what the feedback or blowback might have been, wouldn't you think that if the buzzing of U.S. aircraft over the South China Sea or wherever it typically happens resumes, that would be a message that, forget the summit, it didn't really produce any benefits. I mean, wouldn't that be an obvious thing that she would be very careful about resuming those buzzing incidents, assuming that he has control over who buzzes who? Now, maybe that's an Air Force or an Army decision that he doesn't participate in. I don't know.
Well, and unfortunately, yesterday there was an incident, so we know that that they haven't stopped. Now, if you were to go to Beijing and ask them why the incident happened yesterday, they would say, well, the United States sailed a destroyer, a U.S. Navy ship, too close to what they say is a Chinese-held island. Of course, what an American would say, what I would say is that this U.S. destroyer was sailing legally in international waters. So it did everything 100% according to international law, and there was absolutely nothing wrong with that. And the Chinese are therefore wrong to challenge that vessel. But this is the reality we're in, right? The two sides have a completely different view of some elements of international law, of what the existing status quo is. And that's not going to change. And I think this is part of the challenge, Tyler. So what Xi and Biden agreed to when they met was a resumption of military to military discussions. And that's good. But the reality is, I am very convinced, and I've been convinced for a few years, that even if those discussions happen, they won't matter because the two sides just fundamentally disagree about international law, about what the status quo is. And that's not going to change, even if we're talking more. So I agree with the premise of your question that, if we're talking about stabilizing the relationship, but we're still seeing these crises happen, it doesn't seem like we've really made a lot of progress. Now, I think what the Biden team would say, what I know the Biden team would say is, you've got to start somewhere. And we weren't talking much before. And so now if we're talking more, that has to be better. And I don't disagree with that, right? Clearly not talking is not better than talking. But I think they then have to show the next step, which is they have to show results from these conversations with the Chinese. And that's what we haven't seen yet.
June, do you want to handle the questions from the audience, or you want me to?
Sure, it's fine. First question is, what will likely happen to the TSMC? I guess that's the semiconductor in the event of a mainland Chinese takeover of Taiwan, whether by armed force or peaceably?
Well, great question. I have a colleague at the American Enterprise Institute who's written a great book on this, Chris Miller, called Chip War. And it goes into all the details, but I'll just give you my perspective, which is that TSMC is an incredibly important company. It's not the only chip manufacturer on Taiwan, but it's certainly the most important. And the reason it's critical is that it is the manufacturer of almost 80% of the world's most advanced chips. So if you are buying any Apple device, the advanced logic chip that is in your device is made by TSMC in Taiwan right now. No one else in the world can make it. Samsung in Korea can get close on some kinds of logic chips, but basically they make almost every chip. If you've bought an iPhone for years, that's the chip in your phone. Why is this important? Well, if TSMC were to stop operating tomorrow, it means that you couldn't just not buy an iPhone for a couple of months. You probably can't buy an iPhone of anything like the same quality for years. You probably can't buy a car for some number of years because Taiwan has become so critical to semiconductor manufacturing. And if you had to buy a car during the COVID lockdowns, you'll remember how difficult it was to find a new car. That was nothing compared to what would happen if we lost access to the facilities in Taiwan that build some of these advanced semiconductors. So what would happen if there was a contingency involving Taiwan? My guess is that TSMC would essentially shut down. Why? Because there's another company, which is a Dutch company from the Netherlands called ASML, which makes one of the most advanced parts of this semiconductor fabrication process. It's something called extreme ultraviolet lithography. This is what basically etches onto a chip the circuit that allows that chip to function. This is basically the most advanced technology in the world. There is only one company in the world that can do it at this scale and level of expertise. It is called ASML, and those machines require teams of people to keep them running. So it's not just that these fabrication facilities in Taiwan have to be up and running and not disturbed. It's also that they need to have the Dutch engineers and others there to keep them running. And so my fear, and I think the fear of many who watch this, would be that if there was a conflict over Taiwan, that essentially these fabrication facilities would stop running. And they would stop running for quite some time. So all the chips you try and buy from basically any advanced device would probably not be available for some number of not just months, but potentially years. There are things that we are doing to try and decrease our reliance. But some of you have probably seen the CHIPS Act, which would build fabrication facilities in the United States. At best, this would take less than 5% of those advanced microprocessors and make them here in the United States. So it wouldn't even get close to addressing the demand within the United States for these advanced chips. So we have at the moment basically a single point of failure in Taiwan, and I don't think that is going to change anytime soon. The one thing I'll just add as a final note is some people worry about whether China could take over Taiwan and then turn around and use these fabrication facilities itself. My guess is that's not possible. Those Dutch engineers would be gone overnight. The expertise in Taiwan to be able to run these fabrication facilities is tremendous. Any little perturbation makes it impossible for them to build these most advanced chips. So in short, if there was a Taiwan contingency, the US would lose access to chips, but so would China and the rest of the world as well.
Okay. Another question. Do you think it is safe for Americans to travel to Taiwan? I have a college student who is considering doing a study abroad program in Taiwan in the fall of 24.
I do. I have no concerns about traveling to Taiwan. I was there in October. I was there in September. You know, it sort of comes back to what I was saying earlier. I think the likelihood is that if there's going to be a military action around Taiwan, it's going to have a trigger. Now, does that mean that there's some heightened tensions around key elections or other dates? Yes. January 2024, May 2024 for Taiwan's elections. November or January for the US elections could also be something to watch. But I think at the end of the day, going to Taiwan is basically safe. Of course, if there was a contingency, that would affect people living on Taiwan. But I got to tell you, I think the odds are that it would affect a much broader swath of the region as well, including Japan, potentially Korea, certainly the Philippines, US holdings in those areas, US territory like Guam, Australia potentially. So if I were thinking about traveling to Taiwan, I would be confident about doing so. You know, to be candid, I haven't gone to China in quite some time because I'm less confident about safety there than I would be about safety in Taiwan. So I wouldn't worry about this for the time being.
So when you were saying safety to China, what would be your concerns about traveling? Are they interested in opening up tourism?
So they're trying, and one of the things that was announced around the Biden-Xi meeting is a resumption of direct flights, going up to 70 flights a week between the US and China, which sounds like a lot, but it's actually a really low number compared to where we used to be. The reality, though, is that a lot of people, including China experts, don't want to go to China anymore. They don't feel safe. They don't feel like they're able to do the research they want to do in China. And you know, I'll just give you my personal vignette of this, which is that I used to go to China with a group of American experts. We went once a year at least to meet with Chinese scholars. So these were scholars at Peking University, at Tsinghua. These are sort of the, you know, think of Harvard and MIT, right? The equivalent in China. And we met and we had good discussions with Chinese counterparts who we knew pretty well after going there for a number of years. On our last trip, one of the people that was there on that trip was a Canadian. He happened to be living in China at the time. And in response to Canada following a US extradition request for a Chinese Canadian who at the time was living in Vancouver, the Chinese just grabbed him and put him in jail for basically 2 years for no reason other than to use as essentially a hostage for bargaining. So, you know, when you're in an expert group and one of the 8 or 10 people that's in that group gets put in jail for 2 years, makes you a little cautious about whether it's worth going back. And I think you're starting to see some American experts go back to China, but I got to tell you, a lot of my friends who, in some cases, they were the people that sort of opened China up for the United States, right? Some of these people have been the translators for American and Chinese leaders going back to the 70s. They no longer feel safe going to China. And that, I think, tells you how bad things have gotten.
Zach, I think we're down to the last question, so I'll sing it to you.
Yeah.
I am constantly amazed at how sloppy Taiwan seems to be about its defense spending. As you know, they only spend 2.5% roughly of GDP. You would think, given that there's an existential threat out there that's very clear and obvious, that they'd spend 3 times that. And they've got an army where apparently there's only a 4-month, or at least up until recently, required service time. So I just find that mysterious. Have you ever figured that out? Or
I
oh,
think he
he's
I think he froze. Yeah.
frozen. Oh, there he is.
I'm
Oh,
back.
here he is.
I
Hello.
got the core of your question though, Tyler. I'm sorry about that. So on Taiwan's defense spending, I think you're right to raise this as an issue. At the end of the day, from an academic standpoint, what drives countries to spend more on defense is a perception of threat, right? And usually we measure threat in sort of 5 different ways: how close you are to a potential adversary, how strong that adversary is, whether they have offensive military capabilities, whether they appear to have offensive intentions, and then whether there's a big ideological gulf between yourself and that country. If you're Taiwan, all 5 of those are true in spades, right? So you would think that Taiwan would be spending perhaps more on defense than any other country in the world. And as you noted, they're not. So what's the reason? I think the best explanation is the sort of obvious one, which is that at the end of the day, Taiwan, even if it spent 100% of its GDP on defense, might not be able to defend itself unless the United States came to its aid. And so the people on Taiwan, somewhat understandably, look at themselves and they ask, look, should we spend another dollar on defense, or should we spend it on the economy and social spending? And you know, there's a pretty substantial group of people in Taiwan who say, look, if the US doesn't come to our aid, we have to give in anyways. And if the US does come to our aid, then whatever we're doing doesn't matter that much. And so it really augurs against substantial increases in defense spending. But here, and this is probably a good note to end on, here's where we have to have incredibly skillful leadership from the United States, right? The Biden team wants to say, look, we're going to be with Taiwan and we'll support Taiwan so that the people of Taiwan don't sort of give in to this pressure from China. But at the same time, they don't want to be so reassuring in all situations that the people of Taiwan don't spend enough money on defense to actually ensure that Taiwan can hold out for at least a couple of weeks, if not a few months, long enough for the US to come assist Taiwan, right? And it might take quite some time for US military forces to come across the Pacific to Taiwan's aid in large numbers. So this is the tricky dance. You've seen the Trump administration try and handle this one way with allies, which is to threaten that the US won't be there and to try and force them, therefore, to spend more. You're seeing the Biden team sort of go the other direction and to be 100% reassuring to allies and say, we're definitely going to be there. I think the reality is that both of these approaches have trade-offs, right? If you do what Trump did and you say, we're just going to leave Taiwan or NATO on their own, the reality is that sometimes those countries will just kind of fold and give up because they'll feel like they can't do it on their own. And yet, if you say, as Joe Biden has said, that he would fight for Taiwan, that you decrease the incentive for those countries to do more for their own defense.
Yeah.
And there is no right answer. This is just a tough trade-off. And you know, as somebody that thinks a lot about alliance management, this is one where my view is, like any hard issue in Washington, it's never black and white. You're operating in the gray. And so, you know, what good policymaking here looks like is having quiet discussions with people on Taiwan to explain to them that the US wants to support Taiwan, but we need to see Taiwan support itself. And at the same time, saying to leaders in China, don't try it, right? And doing those two things simultaneously is really hard. It requires really careful policymaking. And, you know, that's kind of what the job of folks in Washington is, to try and be able to pass those two messages along simultaneously to our friends and our adversaries. It's hard, but I think that's really what the Biden team needs to be doing over the next year.
So diplomacy ain't easy, huh?
You heard it
Well,
here
listen,
first.
I wish we didn't have a time limit, but we do, unfortunately. So, Zach, many thanks for joining us. You were terrific, and I think we all benefited from your remarks. So thank you very much. And maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Yes.
That'd be great. Thank you
2027.
so much
How
for
about
having me.
that?
I appreciate it.
Wait,
Yeah.
just a
No,
minute.
sooner.
So anyway, Zach, thank you very much. I think you
Thank
have
you.
enlightened us and maybe made us more nervous as well. But in any case, thank you. I also, to our audience, want to say that our next speaker will be on December 11th at 10 a.m. It's Giovanna Di Maio, who is going to speak to us about Italy. She's a visiting fellow at George Washington University, Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. So we hope you will join us then, December 11th. So until then, we look forward to seeing you again. Zach, thank you so much.